We all knew Joe Biden was facing serious mental decline. I mean, look, you only had to watch the president when he was turning around to shake an invisible hand that wasn't there, or when he was talking about a friend that died 20 years ago that he thought was in the audience before him, or when he had the slow gait walking across the White House lawn, or when he had that invisible glossy look in his eyes as if he didn't know where he was or as if he didn't know why he was even there. If you have eyes, you knew there was serious mental decline. But Democrats, and I got to be honest, many in the media did everything they could to hide it. We're going to talk to Amie Parnes, the co-author of Fight, Inside the Wildest Battle for the White House. She's also a #1 New York Times bestselling co-author of Shattered with her co-author Jonathan Allen. And this book also is a New York Times bestselling book. And guys, you got to go check it out because what they detail in this book is nothing short of a cover-up. Now, let's talk about everyone in Washington. There is not a single person in this town, and I'm being honest, who didn't know that Joe Biden was slipping away. It was almost like whisper. Everybody was whispering about it, but no one wanted to tell the truth. And those of us like myself who would go on television to say what we are seeing is the demise of a sitting president, we need to talk about this. We're told, shut up, that's a conspiracy theory. And now we know, as detailed in Amie Parnes' book, Fight, Inside the Wildest Battle for the White House, that was the truth, what I believed at the time, what many of you believed at the time. You could see it in his eyes, as I stated, like headlights flickering before they'd go dark. But did they stop him? No. They propped him up. They powdered his face. They called it leadership. They literally powdered this guy's face as if they were filming a show of Veep or some other Hollywood taped show about the presidency. Because for them, it was all about maintaining power, maintaining control, pulling the strings for you to believe that everything was okay when the reality is we all knew it wasn't. See, the book Fight doesn't whisper the truth. It screams it. That's why you got to go buy it. The president wasn't ready, and they all knew. The president was declining, and they all knew. His staff, his donors, the media, they lied to the country because the truth was too inconvenient for them because they all hated Trump. That's what it was about. They hated Trump so much that they were willing to ignore the reality that we had a sitting president with sharp mental decline. But here's the thing about lies. They all don't age well, and neither did Joe Biden. The White House team permitted the Democratic Party to shield itself from the harsh realities of Biden's condition. Elected officials were reluctant to say so openly, fearful of being read out of their own party for heresy. Although they would whisper among each other, send text messages on phones saying, what in the hell did I just experience? Something's not quite right with the president. There were concerns about his health, concerns about him getting advice from Hunter Biden, from his wife, Jill Biden. One donor in Amie Parnes' book, she highlights this. Can the president even make it? We don't know. You all saw the famous clip of Barack Obama holding Joe Biden's hand as they walked off stage in New York because the president didn't know where he was. This book recounts the fact that even Barack Obama himself, Democratic juggernaut, he believed that there was something wrong with Joe Biden. And yet, day after day, the White House press secretary, who I know, Karine Jean-Pierre, I have been on TV with her and debated many, many times, would say the president was physically fit. Democrats would say the president can do cartwheels, can do backflips, jumping jacks, 100 push-ups, run a 20-mile marathon. Just believe us. Don't believe your lying eyes. And some people actually did believe them. But many of us did not. And the media, in my opinion, many in the press, are culpable for this cover-up. The White House was ran like a mob. Joe Biden's closest aides, closest advisors, not allowing other aides and advisors to get close to the president. Even cabinet secretaries, I mean, this is outlined in the book. His own cabinet secretaries, who he appointed, had to go through advisors because they couldn't get to the president. And the advisors, the closest advisors, would say, well, we'll let you know. We'll get back to you. Who was running the White House? That is the fundamental question that every single journalist in this country should be asking every single day. Who was in charge of the national security of this country when the president was incapable? When the president didn't know where he was? When the president was staring in the room at walls? Because unfortunately, his mental acuity was declining. And ladies and gentlemen, I don't say this to make fun of the president, because there are millions of Americans across this country who have family members who are experiencing what the president is currently going through. So I do not make light of this. This is an important issue, because we're talking about the direction, the safety, and the stability of our country and your well-being. And so if Joe Biden was not able to do the job, then somebody had to do it. And that somebody is an unelected bureaucrat that we don't know who these people are. Just pause and imagine that for a moment, because this really sounds like something you would see in a movie or read in a novel. Like there's this core secret group of Illuminatis running the country. People would say that's nonsense. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that was not nonsense for at least 3 years out of Joe Biden's 4-year term. And everybody knew about it. His closest aides and advisors, his donors, former President Barack Obama, and the media. And you know what? Let's just say you excuse the aides and advisors, you excuse the donors, because they're all a part of the same party. Like, I'm a Republican, you're going to stick with your camp, you're going to try to protect your guy. That's politics. None of you guys are surprised by that reality. At least I hope to hell you aren't, because if you are, then you've been asleep at the wheel. But what about the press? The fourth estate, as it's called, or at least once was called. Out of all of the characters involved in this cover-up, they were supposed to be the standard bearer for truth and objectivity. And when it mattered most, they failed. When accountability mattered, they failed. But look at the coverage we're seeing with Donald Trump. Imagine if it was any Republican who was in Joe Biden's shoes. There would have been nonstop coverage within the first year or two. The moment there were murmurs that the president isn't quite there, that the president is declining, somebody somewhere, New York Times, Atlantic, Washington Post, somebody somewhere would have written a story about this. But because they disliked Donald Trump so much, and I'm not saying Donald Trump isn't a controversial person. Hell, we all know that, whether you voted for him or not. That's just who he is. But they didn't want him so much that they were willing to cover up and carry water for the president, who his team had to paint his face with makeup to make him look viable and alive before he went before the press, before he went before political campaigns, political rallies, because they wanted him to look like he was vibrant, that he had life left in him, not death, which is an unfortunate reality of life, because at some point we're all going to die, but all of us aren't the most powerful person in the world. So again, who was running the White House? We don't know. I don't know if we'll ever find out the answer to that question. I don't even know if there is an interest in the press to get to the bottom of that. But we should demand it. So that's why I'm happy to have Amie Parnes on, again, the co-author of Fight Inside the Wildest Battle for the White House, to help break some of this down. I mean, maybe, I read through the book. There are some answers in this book. We do get some answers. And maybe Amie Parnes can help us walk through, if Biden wasn't running things, who was? And who appointed them to run things? That's a question we all deserve to know, whether you voted for Joe Biden or not. We didn't vote for his wife or his advisors to lead our country or to be charged and tasked with our national security. And ladies and gentlemen, based on what I read in this book, he was not running this White House. Somebody else was, and we need to know who. And maybe Amie Parnes, who's joining us, can help us break it down. All right, Amie Parnes, my dear friend, welcome to your debut on my show. Thanks for joining me.
I'm so excited to be here.
So, Amie, it's interesting. This is your fourth book, Fight Inside the Wildest Battle for the White House. I'm familiar with your work. you are known in Washington, D.C. for really sort of getting stories that nobody else can get. Now, Amie, for the entire 4 years of Joe Biden's administration, I would say, because I know I said this on TV, it was visible, it was obvious that there was something going on with the president. I just got to ask,
Yeah.
why were so many people willing to talk now instead of when it actually mattered?
I mean, you know how it is, sure, Michael. After
I do, I
a
guess.
president leaves the White House and the aides leave as well, that's when they're more willing to talk. I think if they're, it's same for a campaign. You know, during a campaign, people don't want to talk to you and tell the stories until after the election because they feel
Hmm.
like there will be some kind of retribution or it will lead to an election loss. I think same thing here. So that's why my co-author and I were able to speak to people candidly about what they were seeing. And some of these people were aides to President Biden. Some of these people were lawmakers who came in touch with, who came face to face with him. And they told us a pretty compelling story about what they were seeing when they came face to face with the president.
Hmm. No, I mean, I'm not surprised. I mean, I'm just looking at, some of the quotes. You have one quote here: "The people closest to Biden would never cop to the complicity of their own silence. None of them wanted to take blame for their collective neglect." So, is that still
Yeah.
the case? Or are they still just not willing to admit, like, hey, we knew the president was declining, but we instead decide to hide it? Number one, and Amie, number two, how long did they know this? Like, did this just start within his last year, or was this something that was going on, 3 years of the four?
Yeah, we talked to people who noticed that there was some decline about a year before the debate, the debate
Wow.
in 2024. So we're talking about in 2023 and in 2022, there started to be some question about, whether the president had some cognitive decline. And one of the stories we detail in the book is the president comes into a face to face conversation with Eric Swalwell, the congressman
Hmm.
from California, at a congressional picnic, and Swalwell essentially has to remind Biden who he is. And this is someone who ran against him during the 2020
Yeah.
primary. He's pretty vocal in the Democratic Party. This is someone that Joe Biden, the old Joe Biden, would have known. And he has to remind him. And then there are other instances where, the president, there's one example, an anecdote that we reveal in the book where the president is sort of giving a tour to a group of people and he's leading them into, a locked locker room at the White House, which, doesn't really reveal anything. And
Hmm.
Kevin McCarthy, the former House Speaker, is on this tour and he almost feels like he has to guide the president, and he doesn't understand what's happening and he uses some pretty choice words to reflect upon it.
Yeah, yeah. McCarthy said, "quote This guy has literally lost his mind." And in the White House, I mean, going through the book, I read the book. It's an amazing book, and you detail, in the book, pretty early on in the book, Amie, how a lot of former president's aides were publicly saying the president's fine. You had the press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, saying the president's fine, but privately, it was like a known thing that he wasn't fine, and so much so, his closest advisors were protecting him from the other advisors. So you had to go through them, and then they would say, "We're going to relay this message to the president." No one knows if that actually was occurring or not, but they had a lot of layers around Biden, even from the people who were working for Biden in the White House.
Yeah, I mean, there was a noticeable change. I think I covered Biden for a long time, and there was a notable change coming into the White House where they kept him on a pretty tight leash, and
Hmm.
he didn't speak to press, and he didn't speak to he didn't you didn't see him as much as he used to be seen, and I think that this is why a lot of Democrats right now are sort of blaming his inner circle for kind of
Hmm.
keeping him undercover, and there is a lot of blame to go around right now. I mean, a lot of Democrats have questions about it. They obviously feel like the reason Donald Trump won this time is because Joe Biden and his cognitive decline was pretty bad. And then they had to do the whole candidate switch,
Yep.
and that led to Kamala Harris. And so there's a lot of blame going around the party right now.
Amie, I want to. Eventually, I'm going to get to the media, but I really want to keep unpacking this stuff with the advisors. You had the Robert Hur report that came out that sort of publicly confirmed what people in the White House were discussing. Journalists had heard sort of rumors about what was going on with Biden. Some journalists who saw him and interacted with him, I mean, I know several who I won't name because those are conversations off the record, who said, this guy, I don't know if he'll make it throughout the rest of the term. And that was in 2023. That's only 3 years into the presidency. And so then you have the Robert Hur report that comes out. And, he said the quiet part loud. He said, Biden is an elderly man with poor memory. You write about this in the book and how damaging this was for the White House. I mean, when that report came out, Amie, what was going on behind the scenes at the White House in terms of trying to protect this image of stability that they were exhibiting or displaying to the American people that we now know in your book wasn't really there?
Yeah, I mean, they were always trying to, and I covered the president at the time, and that the White House was always trying to, gloss over what was going on and what we were all seeing. And certainly I wrote a number of stories. My colleagues wrote a number of stories trying to get at his age, and not only his age, but his mental acuity. And there was always this very defensive posture being taken by the White House. Like, how dare we, cover this story? We all knew what we were seeing, that there were questions about his mental decline, but they kept a very tight leash, as I said, and they were very, very defensive and very concerned about his optics, the optics around his age. And as we report for the first time in this book, he was met with a makeup artist when he was traveling overseas. That was his first order of business every day, to be made up. So, and clearly this was the result of a White House that was very concerned about the portrayal of his age.
Yeah, I mean, Amie, you guys, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I wanted to talk about the length and the steps at which the former president's advisors went and took to hide a physically ailing president. I mean, in the book, you guys write how they used heavy makeup to cover wrinkles, to cover liver spots. Amie, I don't even know. What is a liver spot, Amie? I don't know what that is. What is that?
Just blemishes, if you will.
So you guys write that in the book. And even parts about how, they were very particular about the lighting. I mean, all of these things they took almost as if this was like a Hollywood show, like a show about a president. I mean, they took those steps to try to make him up, to make him look vibrant and alive. And I guess it sort of worked a little bit. But Amie, were people who weren't a part of that inner circle, when they saw the president, I mean, were they thinking to themselves, there's something not right? Or was it just like, well, there's something not right, but we just shouldn't say anything and we're just going to go along with this?
I think it was a little bit of both. I think that when we talked to people, they were always reassured by the White House team that everything was okay. And then they would see him in moments like the State of the Union address, where he did pretty well in the last State of the Union address. And he was responding in real time to people. And they felt like if that Biden came out during the debate, and this is why they decided to do the debate, they kind of were forced into a corner. They needed to do something to change and reset the race. And they felt like if Biden came out and was that guy, that they might change the trajectory of the race. And so I think, that was sort of what was happening. But that's why I think right now, Michael, a lot of people are casting blame on the Democrats, and specifically Biden's advisors, because they feel like they were hiding something from them. And I think, his team has a lot of explaining to do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought up State of the Union. I saw that, and I remember watching it, and I was just like, okay, what in the heck, like, what is going on here? Because I just saw this guy several days ago, and you see him sort of staggering around. It's like an elderly grandparent. sort of lost in a
Yeah.
nursing home. And I don't mean that in an offensive way, but I'm just visually describing how I personally saw the president. And then you see him at the State of the Union. So, Amie, I mean, what steps were they taking to kind of, I guess, recharge his batteries or give him the energy necessary to go through a 30, 45-minute speech when you would see him in most normal or ordinary circumstances, he just seemed like he was withering away. And yet this one night, it was like a whole new person.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the big thing, and I think that is what they're going to have to continue to answer for. I think a lot of people have those questions. Sure, Michael, you're not the only one, but yeah, I mean, as I said, they just felt like they had to do something. They were losing. They knew they were losing. They were looking at polling at the time.
So Amie, pause there. You said they knew they were losing. I remember the president was asked in an interview, if I recall, and he talked about how great I think the poll numbers were. So did they know that the president was performing poorly against the now President Trump, then former President Trump at the time trying to return to the White House? Did they know the numbers were bad, and were they just lying to Biden?
They knew the numbers were bad, and that's the thing.
Wow.
They knew, and they had to do something. You know, they all convened a team of his closest advisors, and they said, "How can we change and reset the race?" Because they knew they were looking at internal numbers. They saw the numbers publicly that weren't good. They knew that Trump was in the lead, and they needed to do something significant. And a lot of people ask me, they say, you know, what would have happened if they wouldn't have done a debate? And I think the party would have had to keep Biden, you know, because in one sense, a lot of people were grateful that this happened and that Biden could be on display and they could take action to put Kamala Harris in the race.
I mean, but Amie, I get all of that, but I got to go back to that question though. And I was reading through the book, and you guys, you know, I think you guys were even trying to search for a real answer as I read through the book. It seems like none of the advisors really said, well, yeah, we knew we weren't performing well, but as it pertains to informing the president, and Amie, you tell me if I'm misinterpreting the writing of the book, but it sort of seemed to me that none of them were being honest with the president at the time, because again, he was still saying, you know, his poll numbers were great and you know, this poll and that poll. And I kept thinking, well, that's just that's not true. I mean, I'm on TV debating polls every day. Everybody else was talking about the polls and it wasn't true. It seemed as if Biden was living on an island alone, sort of aloof to the realities of what was going on in the rest of the world. So again, were they not being honest with him, or were they just telling him a little bit to give him hope while they tried to figure things out, as you said?
I think they were living on an island altogether. I think he and his advisors were sort of living on their island. And up until the very end, they had to be convinced to exit the race. I think that, you know, up until the final days, they thought that this was a viable option, that the president could win. And they were telling people that. And not only were they telling people that, but they were sending threatening notes. And we detail this for the first time in the book.
Yeah.
But, you know, his senior team was sending notes to donors and other people saying, look, if you keep this up, if you keep the pressure on him, he's going to have to withdraw and you're going to be left with Kamala Harris. So they are.
So they didn't. You know what? I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I didn't. I was thinking about that point, and I didn't know how pivotal of a point it was to ask. But I guess it is a pivotal one, Amie, because Biden's team, although he did endorse her in part because of Clyburn, his core people didn't want Kamala Harris to replace him.
No,
they didn't have confidence she could even win.
Exactly. They were actively undermining her, Sir Michael. And so, and that is why, you know, it's one of the reasons why we called this book Fight, because there were fights breaking out in every corner. Even like there was friendly fire even happening between the Biden team and the Harris team. And so I think that this was a huge moment where, you know, at a last ditch effort, they were trying to keep their viability and diminish hers.
Amie, you guys outlined in the book, you talked about former President Barack Obama, arguably, you know, the most powerful Democrat, and you talked about how, you know, Obama knew from experience how the job ages a president.
Yeah.
And you talked about how Obama was worried about Biden's condition. And you write in the book, he could see the effects when he watched Biden on television, but kept his thoughts to himself that night.
Yeah.
Why do you
Yeah.
think Obama did that? Because Obama, it was outlined that he wanted an open primary. He did not
Yeah.
believe Vice President Harris could win. You and your co-author Jonathan Allen spoke about that at great lengths. If President Obama was worried about what he saw, why do you think he didn't immediately react? Do you think he or is there any suggestion that he was trying to figure out what was the proper course of action?
Well, first of all, he didn't watch the debate that night. He was one of the few Democrats
Mm.
who didn't watch the debate, so he had to catch himself up a little bit on what happened. But then we find out and we reveal this in the book, that he's having conversations with Nancy Pelosi and the top Democratic leadership, and trying to feel his way around the idea of an open primary, because he
Mhm.
doesn't think that Kamala Harris could ultimately win. And so, in the final hours, even, he's calling people like Jim Clyburn
Yep.
to see what he thinks. And Clyburn knows that he has a call set up with Obama later in the day. And this is the day of the big switch, where Joe Biden drops out and Kamala Harris is officially, trying to be the nominee.
Mhm.
And so Jim Clyburn has to rush behind to endorse Kamala Harris to avoid this conversation that he knows is going to happen with Obama, where Obama is going to ask him about what he thinks about an open primary. So all of these things are sort of playing out in unison, and it's really fascinating to see how it all evolved.
Amie, why do you think the former president, that being Obama, why do you think he believed Kamala Harris couldn't win?
I think he obviously saw her performance in 2019, and
Hmm.
the fact that she wasn't very competitive in that race. And then, there is this sort of understanding among Democrats that Kamala Harris was sort of understated in her role as VP, and wasn't exactly in a position of power to run a campaign. And so I think all of this sort of, it wasn't just Obama, it was this theory among a lot of people that she couldn't win. And that is why he was trying to test the waters on the idea of an open primary.
Do you think that, to the point you just made about a lot of Democrats internally knew that Kamala Harris didn't have power, you said she wasn't in a position to win. Do you think that was orchestrated purposefully by President Biden's inner staff?
I don't know. That's an interesting question, and I
Yeah.
couldn't tell you. But I do know that a lot of people who were in that White House felt like she was diminished, that
Wow.
and undercut, and that she wasn't set up in the right ways to run for office.
Yeah. Wow. Amie, look, this is incredible, and it really does. Like, I know we're in a new administration right now, but this is really important because it speaks of like a mob like mentality of a cover up.
Yeah.
I mean, it really does, Amie. And I have to ask you, you've written a lot about this. Now you've co-authored your fourth book, being on this subject matter. A lot of people out there wonder if the president was facing decline starting as early potentially as 2022, according to some of the excerpts in the book, and progressively got worse. Who was leading the country or making sort of final decisions, perhaps on days when the president wasn't at his sharpest?
I mean, that's the big question that we don't know right now, sure, Michael, and I think
Hmm.
people are trying to find out. I think, there was this school of thought, if he can't compete and finish a race, how can he still be president? And that's something that a lot of people will still have questions
Yeah.
about in the weeks and months to come. But all I know is, we can point to our reporting in the book that shows that people were kind of, they had a lot of significant questions about his cognitive decline. And it was obvious. It wasn't just an anomaly on that one night in June, during the presidential debate, that there were other times, plenty of other times, where
Wow.
people questioned his abilities.
Wow. Plenty of other times. Amie, I know we're wrapping up, but you're a journalist. You're in the press. I'm not a journalist, but I am in the press as a commentator and analyst. I can recall a number of times, Amie, when I would go on air, and I would always try to say this in a respectful way,
Yeah,
because even though I'm a Republican and a conservative, the president is the president for everybody, even if I do not agree with him. And so I was
yeah,
always wanting to be respectful because of my respect and admiration for the office itself. To say, look, there is something clearly wrong with the president. And I would have journalists on air who would dispute those claims. There were many journalists or anchors of major shows on major networks who pretty much said that this was sort of Republican, conspiracy theory stuff. Nothing was wrong with the president. Why did the media do that? Why do you think many of your colleagues, my colleagues, again, being a part of the media, I guess, sort of analyzing politics from a conservative perspective, why did they feel the need to hide this, Amie? Because if I'm being honest, I just don't know if that would have occurred, let's say if it were Trump, on the other hand. And
yeah.
not to
I
be
think,
partisan
yeah,
about it, but I have to be honest. I just don't, I don't think they would have been so gentle with white gloves. It was as if people tried to hide it until that debate happened. And if that debate didn't happen, I would still go on TV and say there's something not quite right with the president. And people would say, no, that's just not true. You shouldn't say that.
yeah, yeah. And I do think that there is an unfair criticism of the press in general over this issue. It's not like
Hmm.
we were asleep at the switch. I know that I can speak for myself. I know that I wrote about this
Yeah,
story
you did.
quite a bit. And you can only do so much when the White House is fighting you back and saying that you're wrong about certain issues. And of course, we kept going. So I think it's unfair to kind of throw everyone into a bucket and say, "Oh, where was the media?" We were
Hmm.
asking those questions, but you know, people on the other end weren't being forthcoming.
Do you think, Amie, the media could have been not all. Let me be clear because you're right. You did write about this, and in fact, there are a couple of times you got quotes from me as a
Yeah.
strategist on should the Democrats in the White House be worried about this. So I do
Yes.
know that for a fact. Do you think, as it pertains to the health of the presidency, of the president in general, as you've covered this story, there's a lot more revelations are coming. Other people, Amy, are writing books about this now as well from different
Yeah.
angles. How important is it for the American people to know that the person who's leading the country is physically and mentally fit?
Oh, it's so important. It's vital. And I think that's why this book has caused such a splash because I think people do have these concerns. I think Democrats also, in rebuilding their party, they have to come to an acceptance almost and explain what happened. I think that they almost owe the American people an explanation of what went wrong and if it did go wrong in their view. And so I think there needs to be some accountability because there is only one guy at the top of the heap, and that's the president. And I think a lot of people have these ongoing questions, and that will continue.
And Mrs. Biden, where was she in all of this?
She was his closest advisor. And what we reveal in the book, too, is that he relied on Hunter Biden as well. He considered Hunter Biden a very close advisor. And both of them were constantly in his ear telling him that he should remain in office and that he should seek another term. And so I think that they're also going to have to answer questions about whether or not he was capable of continuing and what they knew and when they knew it.
Were there any? There's one final question, Amy. Were there any concerns about Hunter advising his father? And I beg this question because we know Hunter was going through several very serious, high-profile legal cases. There was a lot of reporting that he did not have the resources to cover for those legal expenses. Were there any concerns from the president's internal staff or Democrats in general that Hunter Biden probably shouldn't be advising his father on this particular matter because he's going to be a little bit jaded and biased because of his own legal and financial predicament.
Yeah, I mean, I do know that in the weeks before the candidate switch, when advisors saw Hunter Biden play more of a visible role in the White House and was seen in the West Wing, there was a lot of concern about that. And there was concern also among, he considers his son so close that when his son had problems with some of his advisors, including Anita Dunn, that he really relied on his counsel. And I think that speaks for itself too. But yeah, I do think that that a lot of people have questions about why he would rely so much on his son as his son faced all of these problems.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine. I mean, again, Amie, I think that your reporting on this book is excellent and quite riveting. I think about I wasn't quite born yet. I wasn't born until 1990, but I think about the 80s, the late 80s, with Ronald Reagan, and all of the reporting that started to slowly come out here and there after he left the White House about his dementia issues. And Amie, I don't think his White House, from the reporting that I went to research when comparing notes to your book, I mean, the extent that Joe Biden's advisors went from the makeup to the lights to the inner circle saying, you got to come through me and we will relay your message, to cabinet secretaries not being able to come meet with the president. You got to sit with an advisor or relay your concerns to the advisor and we'll get back to you. This, to me, is way greater than what occurred during the end of Reagan years. I don't think we've ever seen anything like this ever. There's no precedent for this.
No, there's really not, and that's why it's so remarkable. And there were many other anecdotes in the book, and I hope people listening and watching will read the book. But we detail a fundraiser where a donor has questions about whether the president will be able to make it because the president is trailing off. We have another fundraiser where he's there at Phil Murphy's house, the governor of New Jersey, and he has to be led around by fluorescent tape on the ground, and he's using a teleprompter in a house, which is pretty astounding. So the list of examples goes on and on and on, and it's quite remarkable when you read it.
It really is. And look, I highly recommend you guys go and buy this book. You can buy it on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, wherever you buy your books. Fight Inside the Wildest Battle for the White House. Co-author Amie Parnes, her co-author Jonathan Allen is also a great reporter. This is their fourth book. They're the New York Times bestselling authors of Shattered, which is also an amazing book. But guys, go and buy this book because Amie and Jonathan display a wealth of information that we just have never heard. All of a sudden, all of these advisors now want to talk. And I think we as Americans, we deserve to know what was the physical and mental state and predicament of the president of the United States, what was going on internally. You're not going to get better information than this book. So again, I highly recommend it. Amie Parnes, thank you so much for this brilliant reporting, this brilliant book. I do appreciate it. And I hope people go out and buy this.
Thank you so much, Sir Michael. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. I think this is just the beginning, guys. Amie Parnes, thanks so much. I'm Sir Michael Singleton. Thank you for watching this episode, guys. And, look, politics is complicated. We know that politicians are humans like the rest of us. But when the most powerful man in the world isn't in the best shape to lead the country, don't you think you have a right to know about it? And then the bigger question is, if he's not leading the country, then who is? And we still don't know the answer to that. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Take care.